Friends, very good to have you join us again. James, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ian. Yeah, yeah,
And your jaw is better, and I've had a week's holiday. So
yeah. So we're in fighting fit, aren't we?
we are. What's not to like?
Yeah,
Fighting fit with the lectionary.
yeah, yes. As we now draw to the end of the season of Trinity, with the last Sunday after Trinity.
That
Yeah,
is weird. It's a very weird terminology, isn't it? The last
it is.
Sunday of
Yeah,
Trinity or last Sunday under Trinity after Trinity.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
and our last foray into these chapters in Matthew's Gospel.
yeah. It's been remarkably consistent, hasn't it? We've just had passage following passage, following passage, following passage, which has been really lovely, hasn't it? Because you do really pick up what Matthew's trying to do. So we're in Matthew 22.
Yep.
And it's verses 34 to 46.
It is only if you follow the readings for the last Sunday after Trinity.
Yeah, and we have missed out the bit with the Sadducees, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
Precedes it. I don't know if that's usually, if there's more Sundays after Trinity, you get that one. I haven't looked that up.
No. Somebody could comment, couldn't they?
Yeah, somebody.
Because friends, you can comment on the video, and we can have a little debate here.
Yeah,
and you could even do a little like if you like it, so that
that would be great. Yeah,
and you can share it on social media as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And what else can you subscribe?
Subscribe to the channel. Yeah,
yeah, great. So, notice how I slipped that in there. So
I noticed it's very smooth. Yeah,
very good. But the other alternative, of course, is that some people will treat the Sunday as Bible Sunday.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah.
In which case, the reading this year is also, I don't know if you looked it up, is also from Matthew, and it's Matthew 24, and it says awkward verses about all the things that are going to happen with the Son of Man, sign the Son of Man. And if you wanted to do that, then there was another blog post. If you just search on the blog for what is Matthew 24 all about, then you'll find the explanation of that. So
yeah,
but we're going to stick with the last Sunday readings, aren't we? So
here we are. Yeah,
good. Okay. Now last week we actually did talk quite a bit about the structure and the shape of things. So I'm not going to do that again.
No.
But we just noticed, didn't we, that there are Jesus in this section here. Jesus does 3 symbolic actions.
Yes.
Entering the city on a donkey, overturning the tables in the temple, withering the fig tree.
Yeah.
And they're all related to Jerusalem and the temple, aren't they?
Both. Yes, they are. Yeah, yeah. And then we have 3 sets of 3, don't we? So we have 3 symbolic actions, and then we have 3 parables, which I think we've explored all of them actually.
Yeah, the 2 sons.
2 sons, yeah.
He said he would work, didn't, in the other. The wicked tenants
in the vineyard, yeah. And the final one was
wedding banquet.
The wedding banquet, yeah,
that's right. Yeah. Which we did explore, and it's really interesting to see that interest in the videos has picked up because there's some really challenging stuff there. So if you haven't looked at it, do go back and look at the previous videos and the articles and that, because the wedding banquet has this sort of double judgment thing where the king destroys the city and also then throws out the guy who isn't dressed properly. So yeah, which is challenging stuff there, really. Yeah.
It was really challenging, wasn't it? Yeah.
And now we've reached the third of 3 hostile questions to Jesus. That was the third set of 3, wasn't it?
Yeah. We've had a question about taxes, which we looked at last week.
Yep.
Render to Caesar and all that. And then the in between, which is sad to have missed out, isn't it? Because it's such an interesting passage. I think we did do a video on this, perhaps maybe last year in the Lucan version, but the Sadducees question about the resurrection.
Yeah. And do you know why they're called Sadducees?
Yes, because they don't believe in the resurrection.
They don't believe in the resurrection, so they are sad, you see.
When I looked at that, I kind of felt this inevitability that I was overwhelmed at this joke, which dates back about 2,000 years.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Could it be even before English was invented? This
absolutely.
So that was interesting. We missed out that, and now we're back to the Pharisees today.
Yes, we are.
A question that they used to test Jesus. And this is verse 34 onwards. Yeah,
it is. So and it's worth just pausing there for a second, because there's something quite interesting going on in terms of the scene setting here, isn't there? And the contrast with, or the contrast, the slight differences, the tweaks that Matthew makes, or that Mark has made, the differences between Matthew and Mark, in that it seemed to me there's a couple of things going on. One is that we'll see in a number of different ways that Matthew is a little bit more picky and careful about both his description of the opponents on the one hand, but also his we're coming to the summary of the law, his depiction, his description of Jesus's language. So that's kind of interesting. But whereas in this instance, in the parallel in Mark, that Mark is more sort of general, Matthew's very specific here, isn't he? So there's a kind of switch and bait thing going on, where on the one hand, the Sadducees have tried to trap Jesus on this question of resurrection, which we haven't looked at now, but we looked at last year in the Lucan version. No, it can't have been last year in the Lucan version, because last year we did Mark's gospel.
I know. The weird thing is, I remember doing it in the Lucan version. So I don't know whether
2 years ago then.
Weird though, because we weren't doing videos 2 years ago, so I don't know what's going on there.
Oh well, maybe it's your memory.
Unlikely, I think.
Anyway, we did it. We'll find it. Put it in the comments, folks.
Yeah. Certainly remember a substantial.
But it's really striking here, isn't it, that Matthew says specifically the fact the Sadducees failed to trap Jesus, therefore the Pharisees are now trying to trap. So you get this repeated theme of trying to catch Jesus out.
Yeah, and what it does, I think, here is that it presents both of these groups as hostile to Jesus in some way and in some aspects, not in every aspect of their understanding, but in some aspects. And they're both wanting to either get Jesus on board or to prove him wrong. And so there's that kind of a agenda there. And I think that comes across in this particular one because of the way Matthew expresses it in verse 34.
Yes.
So the Pharisees, almost as if they see an opportunity. Well, the Sadducees have been silenced. Let's see if we can. I feel actually is not particularly that they're trying to. I mean, it is of course to test Jesus, but I do wonder a little bit whether they come now to either hope that Jesus might affirm them in something. It may be that they're trying to trap him, but and I think
it does use that language of testing.
It does.
And the verb used is pyradzo, which of course
has been used already in Matthew, hasn't it? Of the devil's temptations, testings.
Yep.
And it's been used in other situations as well, I think.
And in the previous episode as well.
And the previous episode. So these are testing questions. But I suppose the implication of a test is that you could pass it, you could fail it, you could pass it. I don't know, but it is, maybe it is hostile, but I just don't think it necessarily reads like that.
But Matthew's very clear that Jesus is facing opposition, and again,
he is,
and of course, in the next chapter, which we won't look at, we then have all these woes, the 7 woes. So the sense of sharpness of opposition, both directions. So on the one hand, Jesus is really put on trial, as it were, here, tested out. On the other hand, Jesus' rebuke of those who refuse to hear his message is incredibly stern, and that does fit with those earlier difficult passages, particularly with the one of the banquet, the wedding banquet, with that double judgment scene. So Matthew doesn't hold back from seeing.
No, he doesn't. I mean, it's a bit tantalizing that we don't hear what the Pharisees' immediate reaction to the question about the summary of the law is.
No.
There is no reaction in here, so you don't know whether they thought, "Oh, that's a novel thing for Jesus to say," or "Quite like that," or that really doesn't agree with our view of the law, or whether it kind of, we're reasonably satisfied, but you don't really know, do you? Except that right at the very end of the passage, of course, there is a summary, which I absolutely think is marvelous. From that day, nobody dared ask him any more questions. It's a sort of
that would be a nice position to get to, wouldn't it?
It would be, it would be. And after these very intense series of conflict stories.
It would be fascinating. Yeah, it would be fascinating on social media if we got to Twitter. Suddenly, somebody gets up to the answer and said, "Oh well, Twitter, we can just stop doing tweets now because the answers we've had from our are so good." That would be interesting.
I may have just seen a flying pig actually in
a whole flock of them.
Yeah. But it is interesting. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say on that point about the sort of reaction. I mean, this is another contrast with there's a parallel encounter in Luke.
Yes.
Luke 10. And again, it raises the question of, are Luke and Matthew recording the same thing in a very different situation and doing something with it? Or is it the case that this kind of question was asked of Jesus?
Yeah.
And therefore, it seems if this is an important question, it seems perfectly plausible that people would have asked him on more than one occasion. So necessarily to harmonize. And of course, in the Lucan version, there is a sort of following discussion, and Jesus said, "Oh, you're not far from the kingdom," and there's a positive agreement around that sort of thing.
And my suspicion is that the contexts of both Mark and Luke are quite different from Matthew. Yes. And the reason and the motive for asking the question is actually also, I think, different there. I mean, in Luke, it's somebody who's trying to understand, isn't it? And
there's a much more sense of a genuine dialogue there.
Yeah, it's not a test in the same way. in quite the same way. It's not a hostile test. Yeah.
And that raises a really interesting question, which is about how these summaries of the law of Scripture, how they function. And it just so happened I was at a wedding yesterday, and
right. Okay.
somebody came up to me in the wedding. I was actually preaching at the wedding. I was speaking, and somebody came up to me afterwards and just said, "Oh, hello. You might not remember we've met before because you came to our church, blah blah blah." And said, "Oh, you gave a summary of the Bible in this." It was actually my grey booklet. She said, "Oh, I'd read
yeah.
called What's the Bible All About?"
Yeah.
Now, and she said, when I read that, I've been a Christian for years, but when I read that, I suddenly saw the Bible in a whole new light, because nobody before had actually given me a summary kind of overview.
Yeah.
So that was quite good timing, wasn't it? Considering we're talking about this today.
It absolutely was, and it just shows that the same questions arise in our hearts as they did in the first century. That the big picture is really, really important. And of course, the Pharisees were well known, weren't they, for the detailed picture?
Yes.
But people at that time also wanted the big picture, and in order to, well, put everything into a proper context, and we need that too.
We do. And in fact, in that classic book from the 1980s, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee and Stewart, they say at the beginning, to read the Bible well, you need two essential skills. One is to have the overview. The other is to have the detail.
Yeah.
So they don't actually provide the overview, but what they provide is the detail. And what the book does, it goes to each kind of literature and says,
yes,
this is what this kind of literature is trying to do. And this is how to read it well. So they're looking at the particular, but they say, look, to complement this, you do need to read Ian Paul's Grow booklet. They don't say that. They say you do need
that would have been
a
prophetic word indeed.
It would have been, wouldn't it? Yeah, because I hadn't written it then. But you do need to complement a focus on the detail with seeing the big picture, so you can see how it fits in and how the parts relate to the whole. And you need to do both, because on the one hand you need to have the big picture, but you also need to know the specific details here so that you can read them well, sometimes in tension with the other detailed parts as well, and see how they all fit together.
Yeah, and that seems particularly true, doesn't it, in Jesus' answer here, because he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind.
Yeah.
Well, love the Lord your God is fine. That's a nice big picture kind of phrase. But then actually the law and indeed the teaching of Jesus is about precisely how to do that in different contexts, isn't it? And details.
It is.
Because
well, I was going to say the other thing that strikes me is, and we'll come back to the sort of particular context in Jesus was speaking, but one of the things that I've noticed, it happens on social media and in conversation and in some of the difficult debates we're having at the moment specifically, which is that people often will take a summary, or even take Jesus' summary, and say, therefore we don't need the detail anymore.
The
classic one being saying, well, if you love someone, therefore you must believe X about what you say to them. And what then happens is that the summary of the law or Scripture or Jesus' teaching gets detached from and replaces the specifics. Whereas actually Jesus seems to be doing something quite different here. And it seems to me really significant. Now, coming back to this whole question of the conflict, of course, one of the things the Pharisees and the Sadducees disagreed about was which parts of what we would call the Bible actually constitute Scripture. So the Sadducees only believed in the Torah as law, whereas the Pharisees would read the Haftarah, read the prophets and the writings as well. And I think it's quite interesting that Jesus chooses his summary verses from two parts of the Torah. So the first one coming from Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. And the second one coming from, I always have to look this up,
Leviticus 19.
Leviticus 19, is it verse 18?
18, I think.
So which is quite interesting, because having been challenged by the Sadducees and now the Pharisees, he actually chooses an answer which is going to satisfy them both.
So he goes to the Pentateuch, goes to the Mosaic books. Fascinating. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think one of the things you point out on your blog, or have done in the past, is that there are other summaries of the teaching of the Bible, of the law, in the Old Testament.
Yes,
and
they're the ones that people often often go to. We often go to.
Yes, we actually know some of them really kind of quite well and by heart, but they're not in the Pentateuch. I mean, they're not in the Mosaic.
That's true,
because obviously they came after that. But Jesus could have said, well, actually, of all those, he could have selected one and said, this is the one I think is really the most helpful. like, Micah 6, to love mercy, walk humbly,
to act
justly,
now
love
look, you're
mercy, walk
hoisting
humbly
yourself
with
by
your
your own petard, because you just said we knew this by heart.
I know. You're
He
brutal
has shown
today, aren't you?
all you people what is good. What does the Lord require
Require of you?
To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
Yeah, and
which interestingly has that same dynamic, because acting justly and loving mercy is about loving people.
Yes.
Walk humbly with your God is about loving God.
Yeah. So there is a consistency and other thing, but there's other summaries as well, aren't there? In Isaiah, I think in Habakkuk, places where
yes, in fact, there's a lot of
things.
rabbinic discussion about this, about how do you summarize the law? And I just mentioned there were common ones. Actually, they're not ones that some of them are not ones that we draw on very much, but it was thought that Psalm 15 summarized the law in 11 points. But Isaiah 33 summarized the law in 6 points. Micah 6 verse 8, you've mentioned, 3 points: act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Isaiah 56 verse 1 and 2, I don't know what Isaiah 56 1 is. Oh, keep justice, do righteousness, for soon my salvation will come, my righteousness will be revealed. Amos 5, seek me and live. Habakkuk 2, which Paul draws on, of course. The righteous shall live by faith. So there also are, just in terms of, we've kind of got on to now the context of Jesus is saying, and one of the most famous ones from that period is Rabbi Hillel. So just and was challenged by someone to recite the whole law while standing on one leg.
It's great. It's great thing, isn't it? It's like a riddle.
It is. And standing on one leg, by the way, is very good. So you ought to do it every day.
Yes, you should. Yeah, Michael, Doctor, is it Michael Mosley?
Yeah, that's right. So you just don't lose your sense of balance.
Yeah.
In every way. And so Hillel stands on one leg and says, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole Torah. The rest is explanation. Go and learn. Now, what's interesting about that is that he again does the thing that Jesus does, which he doesn't disconnect. He doesn't say, here's the summary, now you don't need the detail. He says, here's the summary. Now you know what the whole Torah is about. Now go and read the detail in that light.
Yes. And then you will see how that summary is worked out in life. Yeah,
it is. So interestingly, Jesus has already offered a summary in Matthew 7 in the Sermon on the Mount.
He has, well, the golden rule, hasn't he?
It is, and it's the kind of converse from Hillel. It's the positive version, isn't it? So he says, so in Matthew 7 verse 12, he says, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. But again, he's connecting. He's saying it sums up the law and the prophets. He doesn't say you don't need the law and the prophets now. Just remember that rule. And there's an interesting question there, isn't there, about we've noticed the need for us to see the overview, because Scripture itself is a big book, and we can not see the wood for the trees. There's something, seems to me, quite strongly implicit in the movement the other way, which is that Scripture assumes that we need to know the detail, because by ourselves we don't know what love looks like. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that strikes me over and over again reading Scripture, that we in our culture we kind of assume that everybody knows what love is, or what kindness looks like.
You might just say love is love, mightn't you? Love is love. Love is love. Just love people.
But Scripture challenges that over and over again. And anybody who's done any ethical, any ethics knows that those answers, they're not simple questions very often. But Scripture challenges it and gives us a vision of what it is in different contexts, I think. Yeah. The other thing that strikes me particularly about, talking about the golden rule for a moment, is that Jesus chooses to express that positively, whereas Rabbi Hillel chose it essentially negatively. And one of the things in preaching and teaching that I've often found is it's quite easy to slip into saying, don't do this.
Yes.
Whereas it's much, much better to say, do this. And we've mentioned already, haven't we, in previous videos, where we really must be telling people what has God done for you, and therefore how we should act, rather than saying what you should be doing, for God. And I think there's a massive difference between those two directions, and how encouraged we are by what God has done for us, by the positive thing.
And it's really essential to root what we need to do in what has already been done. I mean, it's the old saying, isn't it, that
Yeah.
The indicative precedes the imperative. So,
Yeah.
we need to understand. I mean, this is really, again, this has struck me very recently about. It was interesting at the wedding. At the wedding I was at, I was preaching. I mean, preaching primarily to the couple. Of course, everyone's overhearing.
Yes.
And it was very interesting in their order of service. One of the things they'd done is that we had the normal things. We had the hymns and things, and everything was happening. But at the end, there was a long, long list of all the people they wanted to thank. So, and it was kind of like a little commentary on the order of service. So we sang a song, and then at the back there was a description of who was in the music group. And then we had a reading, and then there was an explanation of who was the people who'd done the reading. And then there was, well, the address, and there was a bit about me and so on. So now what was fascinating was that you then had at the end of this, you had a catalogue of all the people and the relationships. And I commented in my sermon that this was quite like Romans chapter 16.
Yes, yes.
In that, isn't it fascinating for Paul that he's gone into all this heights and depth and the amazing things God has done for us in the most challenging book in the whole Bible, probably.
Yeah.
But, when he cashes that out in practice, look, he's got all these relationships. And what's fascinating is that Paul says, and I learned this from this person, and this person came to faith before me, and this person was ahead of me, and this person has done this for me. So there's a sense in which, despite all the complexities of theological thinking, actually there's some real practical, tangible things. And, and that sometimes, again, Scripture does that for us and says, look, if you want to know what it means to have your life transformed by the love of God, here's the thing, just be kind to your enemy.
Yeah. But
if you can do that, then okay, maybe you've understood what God has done in Christ, because of course He's turned us from enemies to friends and so on. I think we've got to be aware of saying to people, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. On the one hand,
absolutely.
On the other hand, there's an amazing positive power of examples.
Yeah.
I was at a British New Testament conference in September, and I met somebody who said, "There's a great book you should read. It's a little commentary on Romans, as it happened, by an Italian philosopher," this person said to me.
Wow.
And he said to me, "I wanted to read it in the original, so I learned Italian." I thought, well, if he can learn Italian to read a book, I can learn Italian too.
That was like a red rag to a bull to you, wasn't it?
It was really, yeah. So I actually spent the last 2 months learning Italian. And so when we went on holiday to Italy last week, that's where we were, I was able to order our dinner in Italian. So
splendid. Yeah.
I just suddenly realized that I do find that it's interesting, the power of someone's example. And someone says, well,
yes,
I could do this. You think, well, I could do that too.
Yes.
Which is why, without loading people with guilt and authorities, actually to give people practical examples in our preaching of, okay, this is what Scripture says. How might that work out in practice? Well, let me explain to you how it's worked out for me. Yeah. And actually, I think that can really inspire people's example.
Yeah, and of course, we read this text here in Matthew, don't we, through the lens of the cross, and inevitably, and puts you in mind of John 3:16. For God so loved the world, He loved the world in this way, that He sent His Son, to be the eternal. So that's a really, we've been given the example of Jesus. We know what love for God and what love for other people looks like. It's self-sacrifice.
And in the fourth gospel, that's a very strong exemplary tone, isn't it? Because again, John 13, Jesus says, you call me Master and Lord and so on. You're right to do that. And look, I, your Master and Lord, have washed your feet. Therefore, you're to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Just going back to this whole thing about the tension between the general principle and the details. I mean, again, interestingly, Dick France in his commentary, in his great NIC commentary, he draws that out. He says, look, and he's talking about the general principle of summaries of the law, and he says they summarize not only the law about which the question was asked, these two statements, but also the prophets. Yeah. It's interesting that, Jesus gives a summary of the law, but then he says, actually, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
Yes.
And Dick goes on to say, since the whole scriptural revelation is understood to witness to the same divine will.
Yes.
There's a big thing there about the unity of Scripture in relation to the unity of God.
Yeah.
This does not mean, as some modern ethicists have argued, that, quote, all you need is love, so that one can dispense with the ethical rules set out in the Torah. It is rather to say that those rules find their true role in working out the practical implications of love for God and for neighbor, on which they're based.
Yeah, I thought that's such an extraordinary quotation from Dick France, wasn't it?
Yeah, it
really
kind of
helpful.
summarizes what we've been prattling on about for the last 5 minutes, doesn't it? So
yeah, quite.
Oh, and the other thing to notice, interesting, that like love of God comes first, and then love of neighbor, And of course, in 1 John 4, it says, you cannot claim to love God if you don't see, if you don't love your neighbor, you do see. But because of human sin and selfishness, which distorts our perception and our action, we cannot truly love our neighbor. We can't actually know what it is to love our neighbor unless we're first loving God.
Yeah.
I think it was Augustine who said to love your neighbors, to will the best for them. But how do you know what the best is for them?
Yeah.
Unless you're in relationship with God.
Yeah.
Now we spent quite a lot of time talking about this. It's only the first half of the passage.
But
this is significant stuff, isn't it?
It is.
Again, one of the interesting differences here between Matthew and Mark is that in Matthew we have the threefold: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. Whereas Mark expands it into adds strength.
Yes, and very interesting, isn't it?
It is, but there's a reason for that, which is it's trying to translate this Hebrew term meod.
Yeah.
Which actually the rabbis discuss as meaning. I mean, meod really means more or very.
Yeah, it's like an adverb, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. So you say something is good. If something is good, it's tov. If something is very good, it's tov meod.
Yeah.
So it's our veryness. What does that mean? Well, it might mean all our power to do things, our strength. It might mean all our power to grasp things, our mind. It might be our power to affect things in the world. And so the rabbis also talk about it as all your money. So it's all the things you are. And I think, again, it's fair to see that Mark is just expanding this to make it clear. Yeah, because there's an interpretation going on.
Yeah.
And I did in the article there is a link there to the Bible.
There's a Bible study video, I think, isn't there? Which is
Bible
really
project.
Bible project video. Yeah, which are really excellent on these word studies.
Yeah,
very helpful.
Well, in the last couple of minutes, we ought to talk about whose son is the Messiah.
Yeah. So interesting, this, isn't it? Because you
need to talk about this, James, because this leads to your delighted summary where you said.
Well, I think it's interesting. What Jesus comes back at them with a question. He started all this controversy with a question. There's a sort of inclusio going on here, so that he rounds it off. Now that they've asked him all the questions, it's now his turn, very much a sense of that. And he says, what do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? And they come back to him and say, well, the son of David,
which is very pertinent for this gospel, because of course
it is
the genealogy at the beginning organized in number 14, because number 14 is the number of David. Hebrew, the value of name. So 14. Therefore Matthew demonstrates through Jesus' genealogy that he is the son of David.
Yeah, and I think the idea of being son of David is more prominent in Matthew than it is in probably any of the other Gospels. So it's not at all surprising, really, that it's not at all surprising that it appears here. And then he of course he sets them this challenge from Psalm 110, which I think is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. Paul quotes it, of course, as well. And the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Who's the Lord here? Who is he? What's going on? And you can kind of feel this massive confusion in the Pharisees that we have no idea how to answer that. Because it is an unanswerable question, and it feels very much like a kind of just a deliberately unanswerable question by Jesus, but which also puts him in the context of being the son of David, of course, but nevertheless it's a tough one.
And what's fascinating here is the way that Jesus then is drawing together the title that he uses of himself, Son of Man, from Daniel on the one hand, with Son of David. And of course, in Psalm 110, now it's interesting you mentioned that it's the most quoted Psalm. And I think that it's a bit of our theology in the contemporary church that we just miss so much, which is so central to the New Testament, which is the reality that Jesus is Lord. I think we used to talk about it more in the 1980s and 90s. Not that much. The language of lordship, and maybe it doesn't go down well in our contemporary.
Fascinating. I mean, we're in a sermon series on John McGinley's book, The Church of Tomorrow, and actually his first chapter is called Jesus is Lord, and he puts that right at the front of what it means to be the church in our current context. But it's, in a sense, it's unexpected because we've got used to not talking about it very much.
And in the New Testament, the central truth is that Jesus is indeed enthroned at the right hand of the Father. And in fact, that's what the Son of Man language both points to Jesus' frailty, and his vulnerability, the Son of Man will be handed over and crucified on, but to his ultimate exaltation, because that's what happens in Daniel 7, is the Son of Man is exalted to the throne of the Ancient of Days. And of course, the Psalm 110, speaks of that particularly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gosh, there's quite a lot in there, isn't there? As it turns out, short passage, lots of stuff. Maybe just finish on another quotation from Dick France. So, as these 3 symbolic actions have done, the 3 parables, and then the 3 challenging questions. So then we then have the rest of the narrative unfolding. And Dick France says this: what lies ahead of Jesus now is not a triumphant reign over God's people, but rejection by them. Not a throne, but a humiliating execution. It is only after that mission is accomplished that he can look forward to sitting at the right hand of his Father in a heavenly and not yet an earthly kingship. So another great summary there.
Yeah, brilliant.
James, lovely to talk about these things with you. Very stimulating. Friends, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found that valuable. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, ask some questions, put some comments in, especially if you think we've done anything wrong. But you can click on the share button and do subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much, and goodbye.
Bye.